The universe that we see around us is real, but it's only one small facet of reality. The whole of reality consists of many such universes, and they're all equally real, and we call the whole set the multiverse. According to quantum mechanics, all the universes came into existence, but they were all very alike. And then with the interactions between them, interference and other interactions caused them to become different.
What makes me go into multiple copies in multiple universes?
You already exist in multiple copies. Initially, they are all identical. And then when a moment of choice happens, both a microscopic one and one made by you consciously, these identical copies become different from one another.
But why would we need multiple universes?
Suppose you take one of the classic experiments of quantum mechanics, for instance, the prediction of the interference of light. Now, I can show you interference on a simple laser. I'll show you the experiment.
What if the reality we experience were not the only one? What if every possibility, every choice, existed at the same time somewhere else? We have all heard about parallel universes and alternative realities. For a long time, these ideas were relegated to the realm of science fiction and were barely accepted by the mainstream.
Why are we seeing these fucked up worlds?
Because it's a multiverse. And anything that can happen will happen.
But recently, with the advancement of physics, they are beginning to be considered a real possibility, and in fact, one of the most plausible. David Deutsch is one of the scientists who has taken this idea the furthest. A theoretical physicist and pioneer of quantum computing, Deutsch has not only explored the limits of physics, but also the deepest implications of what reality means. According to him, what we perceive as reality is nothing more than a fraction of something much greater, a structure where multiple universes coexist at the same time. This idea has its origin in the work of Hugh Everett III, who proposed that each quantum event does not have a single outcome, but that all of them occur at the same time. However, our consciousness, in its ordinary state, only experiences one of them in a linear way. But if this is true, is there any way to prove it? And more importantly, what implications does it have for us? But before getting into the technical part, and seeing the experiment where, according to David Deutsch, these other universes can interfere with ours in real time, we need to understand something more. What the multiverse really is, and what implications it has, why it changes absolutely everything.
The multiverse theory comes about as an explanation of the predictions of our best theory of physics, which is quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics makes very accurate predictions, the most accurate predictions that any theory of physics has ever made. But if you want to explain why these predictions are so, how these physical events come about, there's no alternative but to postulate that what we see around us is not the whole of reality, that reality is much more varied and has a great multiplicity. This is what we call multiple universes.
So suppose you're walking in Oxford and you have to choose to go left or right.
In that case, for instance, it could be that in half the universes I go left and in half I go right.
And could you say that the universe splits up as soon as you go left or right?
It's not a matter of splitting. This terminology of splitting was the way that the many universes theory was originally introduced, when they thought of there being a universe which then splits into two universes. But nowadays we find it better to think of there being just a certain number of universes, perhaps an infinite number, already there. And then half of them do one thing and half do another.
What David Deutsch is saying completely changes the traditional idea of the multiverse. It's not that the universe splits every time you make a decision. It's that all possibilities already exist. Every choice you make does not create a new reality. It simply determines which one you experience. It's as if all versions of your life are already laid out, and you are simply moving through them. This way of understanding reality aligns with even deeper ideas, such as the holographic universe, or even the possibility that we are living inside a simulation, where all information is already contained at a more fundamental level, and our conscious experience would simply be a trajectory, a line within that system. But if this is true, it means that, in some way, we could be existing in multiple realities at the same time, even if we are only aware of one. And perhaps that would explain certain strange phenomena, feelings of déjà vu, premonitions, or even the impression of having lived other lives. Many people from different cultures and backgrounds have claimed to experience these kinds of phenomena, and some have even dared to speak about them publicly.
We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. To scientifically prove that such lateral change processes do occur, probably all we would have to go on would be vestiges of memory, fleeting impressions, dreams, nebulous intuitions that somehow things had been different in some way, and not long ago, but now. We might reflexively reach for a light switch in the bathroom only to discover that it always had been in another place entirely. We might reach for the air vent in our car where there was no air vent, a reflex left over from a previous present, still active at a subcortical level.
He is Philip K. Dick, whom I talked about in another video on the channel. He was a science fiction writer known for works such as Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, Ubik, and The Man in the High Castle. Many of his stories gave rise to films like Blade Runner, Minority Report, and Total Recall. But beyond his work, he was deeply convinced that he had access to other realities. On one occasion, after a dental procedure in which he was administered sodium pentothal, he claimed to have experienced something extraordinary, the sensation of consciously living in another reality, specifically in the time of ancient Rome. From that moment on, he began to question the origin of his own ideas. He believed that his stories did not come solely from his imagination, but from leaks from other realities. He even went so far as to suggest that death, as we understand it, might not exist, that instead of disappearing, we simply jump from one line of reality to another, an idea that today some relate to what is known as quantum immortality. Philip is just one of many who have had experiences or beliefs about other worlds. But now, it's time to return to David Deutsch and his live experiment on parallel realities.
What is it that forces us to believe in parallel universes? I'll show you the experiment. This is just a piece of cardboard with little pinprick holes in it. And there's one of them, just a single hole. This is a laser pointer that we use in giving lectures. I shine the laser through the hole, and we can see a little spot on the screen over there. And what would you expect to see? You'd expect to see, just if there's one hole, you'd expect to see one spot, but that's already not true. You see quite a complicated pattern. It's called an interference pattern. I'll tell you why. What would happen if we made a second hole? Well, here's another place on the screen where there are two holes. We get a completely different pattern. And through three holes, there's a different pattern again. That's the pattern we get from four holes. The key to quantum theory is what happens when we perform this experiment with very dim light. Suppose we take the laser and we put in front of it a dark filter, very dark filter, so that very few photons actually get through, maybe only one per second. The surprise is that even with this one photon at a time coming through the holes, the pattern is exactly the same as it was when we were shining the bright laser light through. Well, the question is, how do we explain the fact that we see the same pattern, that we detect the same pattern on the screen when there's only one photon at a time going through? And what we must conclude from this is that something is coming through those other holes and shoving our photon aside, and that process is interference.
What is this something?
Well, we can do further experiments to find out what that something is. The conclusion that we draw is that this thing behaves like light in every way we can detect experimentally except one, and that is we can't detect it.
So it's not there.
It is there because it pushes aside the light that we can see, and it behaves like light, and the only reasonable conclusion is that it is light of an invisible kind. What's more, all particles behave like this, not just light, but even the particles in the screen, the particles that you and I are made of. They all are affected, shoved aside, by counterparts of themselves that behave exactly like those particles but cannot be seen.
So they are somewhere else?
They are real matter, real energy, real light that we cannot see, and so they are an entire parallel world of matter, energy and light. That's why we call it a parallel universe. And there are many of them. In this experiment, we can see however many holes we make, there is a different pattern. Even when one photon is going through, there's a different pattern for 6 holes, for 7 holes, for 100 holes, for 1,000 holes, and that means that there must be something traveling through every one of those 1,000 holes and making a difference to the photon that we see.
Making thousands of parallel universes.
And that means there must be at least thousands of parallel universes. In fact, the theory tells us there are a lot more than that.
But this experiment has its origins long before quantum physics even existed. In 1801, a young English scientist, Thomas Young, carried out a demonstration that would change the course of science. At that time, the dominant idea, defended by figures such as Isaac Newton, was that light was made up of particles. To test this hypothesis, Young passed a beam of light through 2 small slits. If light behaved as particles, one would expect to see 2 clearly defined bands on the other side. But that is not what happened. Instead of 2 lines, a pattern of light and dark fringes appeared. A pattern of interference characteristic of waves, similar to what happens when a stone falls into water or when sound propagates through the air. This pointed to something completely unexpected, that light does not behave only as a particle, but also as a wave. Decades later, and building on this discovery, one of the most well-known experiments in modern physics would emerge: the double-slit experiment. With the development of quantum physics, this same experiment would reveal something even more puzzling. When repeated by sending a single photon at a time, the pattern does not disappear. It remains there as if that single particle were capable of interfering with itself. And this is where the interpretation of David Deutsch becomes especially relevant. According to him, that photon is not alone. Even though we only detect one, its behavior suggests that something else is influencing its trajectory, something passing through the other slits, something that interacts but cannot be directly observed. In this view, what we see could be the result of the interaction between our universe and others that remain invisible to us, as if there were a form of matter or energy that we cannot directly detect, yet still leaves an imprint. But there is an even stranger detail. When we try to measure which slit the photon passes through, the interference pattern disappears, and in its place, 2 bands appear, just as we would expect from a particle. In other words, the result changes the moment we obtain information. And this raises an inevitable question. How could all of this affect us? Because if what we call reality, matter, or even life seems to be defined in the act of interaction, then consciousness stops being a mere spectator and takes on a central role. If there are multiple possibilities, multiple possible states of reality, but we are only aware of one, and that one seems to be linked to how we interact with the system, then our experience would not be entirely passive. From this perspective, the reality we inhabit could be deeply conditioned by the way we observe, interpret, and participate in it, not necessarily as a direct creation, but as a selection within a much broader range of possibilities. This connects with ideas that existed long before modern physics. Concepts such as the so-called law of attraction or the law of assumption essentially point to something similar, that our mental state, our beliefs, and our way of perceiving influence the reality we experience. Not as a magical formula, but as a shift in the lens through which we interact with the world. And if this is the case, then what we think, what we believe, and how we interpret what happens to us take on a new level of importance, because ultimately it could influence the line of reality we are moving through. But if all of this is true, if there really are other layers of reality interacting with ours, an inevitable question arises. Is there any way to glimpse them, to experience them directly? Throughout history, many people have claimed to access other levels of reality. This ranges from mystical and philosophical traditions to modern researchers and explorers of consciousness. Many of them have used altered states in an attempt to understand what lies beyond ordinary perception. The problem is that, in most cases, these experiences are deeply subjective. If you don't experience them firsthand, they are reduced to stories, to interpretations, to something impossible to verify from the outside. But some time ago, I came across something different, an experiment that, interestingly, also uses a laser, but not to demonstrate how reality works. Instead, it attempts to see it from another level. Those investigating it describe it in a very specific way, as the possibility of observing the code of reality.
I am the discoverer or the claiming discoverer of a unique phenomena in that it is a repeatable experiment that people can do. I'm not suggesting that people should do it, but it just happens to be the case that if you ingest DMT and you project a diffracted laser on the surface, you will see what seems to be a self-executing code of some sort in the surfaces where you project the diffracted laser.
Imagine for a moment that reality is not what it seems, but something closer to an advanced simulation, so sophisticated that we perceive it as the physical world itself. Independent researcher Danny Goler claims to have found what he describes as a kind of crack, a way to glimpse the source code behind that simulation. But what exactly does this experiment consist of? Surprisingly, it is simple, and at the same time, deeply controversial. It involves a person ingesting DMT, a powerful psychedelic molecule that the human body naturally produces. While under its effects, they observe a diffracted laser projected onto a matte surface, such as a wall or a sheet of paper. What, according to Goler, turns this into something more than a simple hallucination is the supposed repeatability of the phenomenon. Hundreds of people following the same procedure claim to see the same thing, and that is where things start to become truly strange. Because what they describe is not chaotic. In that state, the laser no longer appears as a flat beam of light, but seems to transform into something else entirely, a kind of window. Participants report seeing a moving code with millions of symbols flowing across the surface, resembling Hebrew letters, numbers, or Japanese characters.
So if you bought like a DeWalt laser level at Home Depot and it paints that line across the wall, and then you get somebody that's on DMT, when you look at that, you can see, number one, you can see through the wall. You can even put it on your arm, and the code changes on your arm. While you are in the DMT state, you get close to the wall and you can see code that looks kind of like alien writing, like you'd see, and then some that look like kanji, Japanese characters.
Wow.
And then you get 2 or 3 people lined up, and they all see the same thing.
Do you have any theories on this?
None.
Nothing.
Once you see it, like, your ability to think that you have shit figured out is gone. It's gone.
According to Goler, thousands of people, without any contact with one another, have described almost identical patterns and symbols. From this perspective, what is being observed would not be something generated by the brain, but something that is already there. In this view, DMT does not create the experience. It reveals it. It acts as a kind of tuning mechanism that allows perception to access another layer of reality, while the laser simply illuminates it. Research and investigations into this phenomenon are still being carried out, and although there is still much to understand, it is a profoundly interesting topic to observe. Some interpret it as a possible confirmation of what many explorers of consciousness have described for centuries. There is the hypothesis that, in altered states, whether through psychedelic substances, deep meditation, or even spontaneous experiences, the mind could pass through certain habitual filters of perception. This would allow access to recurrent visual patterns, geometries, fractals, or symbolic structures that appear in a surprisingly consistent way among different individuals. These experiences have reminded me of the accounts of Itzhak Bentov, who described complex visions in expanded states of consciousness. According to what he explained, he perceived reality as a structure composed of a series of forms that he described as interference patterns, many of them resembling Hebrew and Sanskrit letters. His wife, Myrtala, recounted it in the following way.
As you recall, we talked about the interference pattern of information, which is the hologram. Remember that every speck of matter on the surface of this torus is sending out information about itself. Our galaxy does, and so does a galaxy and many other galaxies which have gone ahead of us. So that the information that is being sent out gets interwoven into one web of information about the entire structure. This is the information that one can tap in those higher states of consciousness and, in fact, enter the knowledge that's available about the entire structure, because we are a part of this hologram, that little sliver that still retains some of that information. And by tuning into the totality of the hologram, we can have the information about every part of it. And that's exactly what Ben did. And on top of that structure, there appears to be a very luminous something. And as you approach it closer, this brilliant white light seems to have a shape such as this. And Ben, being familiar with the Hebrew language, looked at that and he said, no, I must be programming myself. This looks like the Hebrew letter Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And immediately the explanation comes. No, this is not a Hebrew letter. This is an interference pattern of 4 energies interacting on this level, on this cosmic level. And they create this pattern, which is a consciousness whose body this is. This consciousness contains the consciousnesses of all the 49 creators. In other words, consciousness is modular. So as he approached this Aleph a little closer, what he saw was that the front of it was a brilliant white light, and the back was dark, and it looked rather three-dimensional. It's a hologram. And there are 22 such forms, interference patterns, emerging from the luminous side, and they look exactly like the Hebrew letters. And he was explained again that these are interference patterns that were observed by seers in antiquity, and they incorporated them into the Hebrew letters, into the Hebrew alphabet, but they are there objectively to be observed. So, as you go through all these levels, finally, you come to a level where all these levels are contained in one sphere, the manifest creation. Everything visible and invisible, everything that ever existed is in it. And around it is this infinite dark void, which is the consciousness itself. And as it vibrates, as we saw before, it creates manifest creation. So as you come closer to this, you begin to discern what appear to be rotating disks covering its surface. And as you look closer, this is what you see. Instead of disks, you see that these are bars having little shapes underneath like that, and these bars spin around. These shapes spin around. And there are 3 layers of these, and the 4th, the outermost layer, looks like this. And you begin to recognize these as shapes known as the Sanskrit letters, and then this one as the symbol which stands for Om, or cosmic consciousness in Sanskrit. So again, you're explained when you ask about it, these are not Sanskrit letters. These are holograms, interference patterns that are active on that level, and they were perceived by the seers and incorporated into the Sanskrit alphabet. So, as you look at this manifest creation, you realize that there must be a consciousness that runs this, the ultimate consciousness. And you want to understand how this structure is run and what's happening with these rotating disks. And you are explained that as this cell or as this being grows, and we saw that it's constantly expanding and developing and evolving, it expands into the surrounding void, which is pure consciousness, as we remember. So that as it expands into it, the void begins to penetrate it. And these rotating disks are acting as modulators of the void. And by rotating, they create a sound, the word of creation, which then begins to interact within itself. It's a hologram of sound or a hologram of different frequencies that begin to create all kinds of harmonics, all kinds of additional sounds that develop out of these interactions of different frequencies. And so the whole thing is forever evolving.
If something emerges from everything we have seen, it is that, although approached from very different angles, many of these ideas seem to point in the same direction. From the rigorous physics of David Deutsch, passing through proposals such as those of Danny Goler, which seek to build bridges between science and what is still not verifiable in the laboratory, to the explorations of consciousness by Itzhak Bentov, all of them seem to point toward a shared possibility. That the physical world is not something fixed, solid, and independent of consciousness, as the more orthodox view holds, but rather the result of deeper processes that we do not perceive directly. Processes that we do not see, but that are there, operating silently, influencing everything we experience, and which perhaps constitute the true origin of what we call matter and life. A reality that would resemble more a system of a holographic nature, where what we perceive as solid would be nothing more than a manifestation within an underlying structure that is infinitely more complex and enigmatic. Some have called it the All, the Field, God, Brahma, or the ultimate reality, although the name at its core is secondary. Its essence remains unchanged. the origin of all that exists, that from which everything that is originated arises and into which it ultimately dissolves. If consciousness were, in effect, the substrate of everything, then what we experience as reality could be modifiable through it. And perhaps understanding this is the first step toward beginning to exert a greater influence over our own reality. Some experiments seem to point, at least indirectly, in that direction. I will leave you here with a few more videos so you can go deeper into all of this. That is all for today's video. I hope these theories have been as interesting and enriching for you as they have been for me. Thank you very much for watching until the end. See you soon.